In the heart of Tennessee, tucked away where the hills rose like guardians over a lonely hollow, a family lived untouched by the world outside. The fog clung to the valleys, curling like ghostly fingers around the weathered log cabins and skeletal cornfields, and no traveler dared linger past dusk, for whispers told of unnatural things. The father of the house, a gaunt man with eyes like dark hollows and hands scarred by decades of labor and cruelty, ruled his daughters with a quiet, bone-deep authority that left them trembling even in sleep. He was the hollow's silent storm, and beneath his shadow, the girls grew in ways the townsfolk would later call unnatural, their laughter mingling with the sighing wind that carried secrets only the trees could keep. No outsider could ever understand the code of this secluded life, the strange devotion that twisted love into something almost monstrous, and the hush of the hollow seemed to press down harder with every passing year. At night, the family would gather around the hearth, the flames casting grotesque shadows on the walls, and in those flickering shapes, one could almost see the threads of a legacy that would not be denied, no matter how dark, no matter how forbidden. The hollow lay hidden deep within the Tennessee hills, a place where sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor and where the wind carried a weight that seemed almost alive. It was a valley carved by time and neglect, flanked by jagged ridges that rose like silent sentinels, enclosing a world that moved at its own sluggish pace, indifferent to the outside. Trees grew thick and knotted, their branches twisting into shapes that suggested hands or claws, and in the autumn, when the leaves turned rust and gold, they fell in muffled heaps that smothered the narrow trails. The hollow was not marked on any map, and few who wandered near its edges ever crossed into its depths, for the stories carried on the wind were enough to turn even the boldest traveler away. Some said the ground itself held memory, that it could remember each footstep that had ever pressed into its soil, and that the whispering of the streams and the rustling of the leaves carried messages meant only for those who belonged there. At the heart of the hollow stood a cluster of dilapidated structures, log cabins stitched together with rough timber and clay, their roofs sagging under decades of storms. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, and yet, it was not warmth that it promised but the scent of old, lingering secrets and wood smoke that smelled of neglect. Paths led from cabin to cabin, overgrown with weeds and brambles, so that the family could move between them as if unseen, always hidden from any wandering eyes. Even the animals seemed different here. Hawks circled silently, their cries sharp and eerie, while crows gathered in restless flocks that never settled for long, as though the hollow itself did not fully welcome them. Nights came quickly and heavily, and in those long, starless hours, the wind would moan through the hollows like the voice of something mourning, carrying with it being watched. Isolation was not merely a condition of geography in the hollow, it was a law and a presence, binding those who lived there as surely as chains. The father, whose influence was absolute, knew how to wield it, and he used the hollow's seclusion to shape his daughters into reflections of his own will. Without outsiders to intervene, the family's rhythms were unbroken, and the hollow's silence became their companion, their witness, and their cage. Even the sunlight that managed to filter through the thick canopy seemed wary, scattering its warmth across the ground in hesitant patches, as if afraid to touch what had grown in the shadow of that secluded life. Time moved differently there, measured not by clocks or seasons but by rituals, small and strange, that the family alone understood, and every step, every glance, every whispered word seemed to fold the hollow tighter around them, binding their lives to its unseen pulse. The father ruled the hollow with a presence that seemed to stretch into every corner of the valley, a quiet authority that left no room for question or rebellion. He was a man carved from shadows and stubborn earth, his face lined not merely by age but by decades of unyielding command, and his eyes held the cold precision of someone who measured the worth of the world in obedience. He moved through the cabins with a deliberate silence, his boots soft against the worn floorboards, yet every step carried the weight of expectation and fear. The daughters learned early that his word was not merely law but life itself, shaping their movements, their speech, and even their thoughts. A glance, a shift in tone, or the slightest hesitation could draw his scrutiny, and under that scrutiny, hearts would pound and breath would hitch as though the air itself had grown thick and heavy. No one outside the hollow truly understood the extent of his dominion. Neighbors and wandering travelers spoke only in hushed tones about the family, their voices trembling with both curiosity and dread. Some claimed that even the dogs and horses obeyed him with an uncanny awareness, responding to gestures that no outsider could perceive. Inside the hollow, There was a rhythm to daily life dictated entirely by him. Meals were served according to his preferences, chores completed according to his timing, and even the smallest disagreements were extinguished before they could take root. Fear was only part of his control. There was a subtler force at work as well, a meticulous shaping of loyalty and dependence that bound his daughters to him not only through obligation but through a warped sense of duty and love. His influence extended to the mind as much as the body. The daughters' education, their exposure to the outside world, and even their private thoughts were subtly guided by his hand. He read their moods as easily as one might read a page, and he could twist affection into compliance with the ease of a gardener pruning a tree. Punishments were rare but sharp, not always physical, but often lingering in the silence, the heavy gaze, or a pointed remark that would echo in their minds long after he had left the room. Over time, the hollow itself seemed to absorb his authority. The walls, the floorboards, the groaning rafters, and even the air seemed to carry his command. When the wind blew through the valley, it was as if it carried a voice that reminded the daughters of the invisible chains that bound them, a voice that whispered that he was always watching, always waiting, and that the hollow existed to reflect his will alone. In such an environment, the daughters' individuality began to fold under the weight of his influence, their desires and fears interwoven with his own. Every smile, every gesture, every whispered thought became a reflection of his control, and the boundary between personal will and paternal command blurred until it was nearly impossible to distinguish one from the other. The hollow did not merely shelter them, it was a crucible for his power, and within it, the patriarch's shadow stretched long, shaping lives in ways the world beyond the ridges could scarcely imagine. The bond between the father and his daughters was a thing that grew quietly, invisibly, yet with a weight that pressed on the hollow like the oppressive summer heat before a storm. It was never spoken of outside the walls of the cabins, and even within, it existed more as a presence than as words. The daughters had been raised under his careful, insidious guidance, taught that his attention was both a blessing and a measure of their worth, and in that delicate balance, affection twisted into dependence, and dependence into something darker. At first, it was the small things, the way he lingered at the doorway when they swept the floors, the subtle correction in the tilt of a head or the cadence of a voice, the way he claimed to know their thoughts before they themselves understood them. These gestures, seemingly benign, became the threads of a bond that was both unbreakable and unwholesome, binding the daughters to him in ways that blurred the line between protection and possession. As the girls grew, the nature of the bond changed. It became more complex, more secretive, and increasingly difficult to name. There were stolen glances across the dimly lit rooms, conversations that carried a tension heavier than mere obedience, and moments when his hand lingered on a shoulder or a wrist in a way that set their nerves alight with confusion and fear. They were taught to accept his authority as absolute, yet the attention they received was at times sharp, personal, and intimate, fostering a strange mixture of reverence and unease. No outsider could have understood it, and the very forest seemed to conspire with the hollow to shield it from scrutiny. The wind whispered through the branches as though echoing unspoken truths, and shadows seemed to twist in recognition of the unnatural closeness that had taken root. The father's control over them went beyond the physical and emotional, it reached into the very ways they saw themselves. He framed their world, their choices, and their desires, weaving a narrative in which loyalty to him was indistinguishable from love, and love itself became inseparable from fear. Each act of obedience, each careful suppression of doubt, reinforced the bond, and the daughters began to mirror his expectations so completely that they no longer knew where he ended and they began. The hollow, in its isolation, became the perfect crucible for such corruption, a place where time, morality, and memory folded in upon themselves, leaving only the quiet, constant presence of the father's influence. Even as the air grew heavy with secrets and the girls felt the unspoken boundaries of their lives shrink ever tighter, there was a sense of inevitability, as though this bond had been forming long before they were born, as though the trees, the fog, and the stones themselves had witnessed its slow, deliberate creation. It was a bond that could not be broken, and in its silence, it carried a warning, a tension, and a shadow that would grow darker with each passing year. Even beyond the hidden ridges and twisting trails of the hollow, the family's presence cast a shadow over the surrounding countryside, carried not by sight but by whispers that clung to the edges of towns and farms. Travelers passing near the valley would sometimes hear faint voices, carried by the wind, that spoke of strange happenings and unexplainable sights, and the stories grew like vines, twisting further with every retelling. Farmers on distant hills swore they saw flickering candlelight moving in impossible patterns, windows opening and closing in rhythm with unseen feet, and once, a man claimed he glimpsed figures standing silently among the trees, their eyes catching the moonlight in a way that felt almost human yet deeply wrong. These whispers became a kind of folklore, a murmur threading through church pews, market squares, and back porches, a story half feared, half fascinated, of a family that lived outside the bounds of ordinary life. The townsfolk spoke of the hollow in tones that mixed awe and dread, calling it cursed, or at least touched by something that did not belong to this world. Children were warned not to stray too close to its edges, and even men accustomed to long nights in the woods kept their fires higher and their steps quicker when the fog rolled down the ridges. Every rumor carried the same undertone. The family within was unlike any other, bound together by unseen forces, their lives governed by rules no outsider could understand, their laughter too sharp, their silences too deep. Stories told of the father's stern gaze and the daughter's pale, solemn faces, and these tales were always punctuated by a quiet unease, as though the mere act of speaking their names invited the hollow to listen. Yet the whispers were not all cautionary. Some carried fascination, dark curiosity woven into every word. Travelers swore they glimpsed signs of prosperity despite the hollow's isolation, neat gardens tucked between moss-covered stones, the faint scent of fresh bread, and the rhythmic hammering of tools long after dusk. These contradictions only fueled the fascination, drawing attention even as fear kept people at a distance. No one dared to enter fully, and those who tried found the landscape itself seemed to resist, paths twisting, fog thickening, and the sound of their own footsteps muted by the hollow's hush. It was as if the land itself conspired to protect its secrets, shielding the family from discovery and giving rise to even more stories, more half-truths, and more whispers carried on the wind. Through all these murmurs, a single idea took root, that the hollow was alive with the unseen, and that the family who dwelled there moved to rhythms and desires far removed from the ordinary world. Each whispered tale added weight to the legend, each rumor a thread in a tapestry of fear, fascination, and inevitability, until the hollow became more than a place, it became a story in itself, a shadow looming over the valley and all who dared speak its name. Among the daughters, it was the youngest who carried a restless mind, a curiosity that flickered quietly beneath the heavy shadow of the hollow. She had grown under the same strict rules, the same watchful eyes, and the same invisible chains as her sisters, yet something in her would not be contained. While the older girls moved with practiced obedience, their heads bowed and their hands careful to avoid fault, she lingered at windows, tracing the movements of the wind through the trees, listening to the distant calls of birds that dared to enter the hollow, and wondering what lay beyond the ridges that enclosed their world. Her questions were cautious at first, whispered under the breath or to the empty air of her room, but they were questions nonetheless, sparks of thought that refused to be smothered by fear or expectation. It began with small observations: how the forest seemed to bend toward certain paths, how the sun struck the cabins differently at odd hours, how the wind sometimes carried the faintest hints of voices that could not belong to anyone alive. These details, inconsequential to most, fascinated her and made her feel alive in a way that obedience never could. She began to study her family with a careful attention that bordered on rebellion, noticing the way her father's gaze lingered longer than necessary, the subtle flinches of her sisters when he passed, and the small, unspoken gestures that communicated more than words ever could. It was a curiosity sharpened by fear, a need to understand the patterns of a life so controlled that every movement seemed preordained, yet every shadow hinted at untold secrets. Her sisters warned her in whispers, reminding her of the consequences of drawing attention, of stepping beyond the invisible lines that bound them, but she could not let the questions go. The hollow, once comforting in its familiarity, began to feel like a puzzle with missing pieces, a labyrinth she had no map to navigate. Her thoughts carried a restlessness that pulled at her during chores, during meals, and even in the long, silent nights when the wind moaned through the trees. She would sit by the hearth, tracing patterns in the smoke curling above the fire, wondering what lives existed beyond their secluded valley and whether the stories whispered outside could be true. Even as the weight of the father's control pressed heavily on her, she began to form a quiet resolve. Curiosity, once a dangerous spark, became a kind of survival instinct. She learned to ask questions subtly, to probe gently, and to watch silently, recording in her mind every deviation from the expected, every hint of contradiction in their secluded world. The hollow, which had been both home and prison, began to reveal cracks to her alone, spaces where shadows did not align, and whispers of truths that could not yet be spoken, but that she would one day confront. It was in the attic, behind a loose plank of wood that had long gone unnoticed, that the youngest daughter discovered the diary. The space was narrow and shadowed, filled with the scent of dust and decay, as if time itself had conspired to keep its secrets sealed away. She had been searching for anything unusual, anything that might explain the restless feeling that had been growing inside her, and her fingers had brushed against the hidden seam almost by accident. The diary was small, its leather cover cracked and brittle, and the pages yellowed with age, each line etched in a careful, deliberate hand that seemed almost alive under her scrutiny. From the moment she opened it, the hollow seemed to shift, the air thickening as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to see what had been concealed for decades. The entries within were at first innocuous, detailing daily routines, chores, and the weather, but it did not take long for her to sense the pattern beneath the words. The diary revealed a life lived under control so absolute that even private thoughts had been filtered, yet it also contained hints of rebellion, small glimpses of resistance that the writer had recorded in secrecy. There were references to fleeting moments of desire, forbidden thoughts, and shadows of acts that could not be spoken aloud. As she read, the youngest daughter felt the weight of generations pressing down, a lineage of control, secrecy, and quiet, insidious manipulation that had shaped the family into something that the townsfolk whispered about but could never fully understand. With each page she turned, the diary became a map of unspoken truths, a guide to the invisible rules that governed the hollow and its inhabitants. The father's influence was evident in every line, every careful omission, and every cryptic note about the daughter's obedience and the boundaries that could not be crossed. There were moments where the writer expressed fear, confusion, and even sorrow, but always tempered by the knowledge that defiance would be met with consequences far beyond punishment. The hollow itself was a stage for these secrets, and the diary illuminated it with a light that was at once fascinating and horrifying. By the time she reached the final entries, the youngest daughter understood that this was more than a record, it was a warning. She could feel the father's presence in the words, not in a literal sense, but in the echo of his control, the lingering power that seemed to stretch beyond the pages and into the hollow itself. The diary held the pulse of the family's twisted life, the unspoken rules, and the deep-rooted fear that had shaped generations. It was a revelation that changed everything, opening her eyes to the full scope of the secrets surrounding her, the darkness in which they had all been living, and the path that lay ahead, fraught with tension, dread, and the unyielding shadow of the father. It began on a night thick with fog, when the hollow seemed to close in tighter than usual, and even the wind dared not disturb the stillness. The father summoned the eldest daughter to the main cabin, the flicker of candlelight casting his shadow long and monstrous across the floorboards. There was no hesitation in his voice, no preamble, only a cold precision that made her stomach twist. He spoke of marriage as one might speak of a harvest or a chore to be completed, and though the words were carefully chosen, their meaning was unmistakable. The notion struck her like a sudden frost in summer, terrifying in its inevitability, unnatural in its audacity, yet delivered with the same quiet authority that had governed every moment of her life. The hollow, as if aware of the gravity of the announcement, seemed to shiver. The flames flickered and danced, casting grotesque shapes against the walls, making it seem as though the cabin itself were recoiling from what had just been spoken. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the life she had known with the impossible proposition before her. The father's eyes, dark and unwavering, watched her for the slightest flicker of defiance or fear, as though he could read her thoughts before she had even fully formed. She felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her, the invisible chains of expectation, obedience, and twisted loyalty that had bound her since childhood. The proposal was not framed as a choice, it was a declaration, a final arrangement in the hollow's silent hierarchy. It was both intimate and grotesque, a merging of familial control and forbidden desire that left her pulse hammering in her ears. The words lingered, echoing in the cabin long after the fire had settled into embers, and she realized that the hollow's isolation had made such a thing possible, a place untouched by law, morality, or the judgment of the outside world. Even the walls seemed complicit, absorbing the announcement and pressing it back into her consciousness with every creak and groan of the timbers. There was no immediate response from her. Compliance was expected, and resistance would have been meaningless. Yet in the silence, a spark of something else began to take root: confusion, horror, and a flicker of the same curiosity that had always set her apart from her sisters. She saw in that moment the full depth of her father's control, the way it shaped thought and will, the way it could bend even the natural order to suit his desires. And while her voice remained still, her mind raced, tracing the lines of the hollow, the legacy of secrecy, and the shadows that had always clung to her family, realizing that from this night forward, nothing would ever be the same, and the quiet horrors of their secluded life were about to take a form that could not be unseen. The daughter's compliance was not born of willingness but of the heavy, unyielding gravity of a life lived entirely within the hollow. From the moment the first proposal was uttered, the shadow of inevitability settled over them like a thick, suffocating fog. Each of them understood, instinctively, that resistance was not an option. It was as if the very air they breathed carried the weight of generations, pressing them into obedience. Their movements became careful rehearsals, their words measured and precise, and even the smallest gestures were filtered through the lens of expectation and fear. The father's control, already absolute, now extended into every facet of their existence, shaping not only what they did but what they dared to imagine. Reluctance showed itself in small ways, in the brief, almost imperceptible tremor of a hand as they carried out chores, in the way their eyes flitted to the shadows at the edge of the room, as though seeking an escape that did not exist. Each daughter processed the unnatural nature of the command differently, some with silent resignation, others with a quiet, simmering tension that threatened to spill over at any moment. Yet all were united by the same inescapable reality: the hollow provided no allies, no counsel from the outside world, no reprieve from the presence that loomed over their lives with inexorable authority. Compliance became a language they learned to speak fluently, an armor against punishment, but beneath it lay a growing unease, a fear that the very fabric of their lives was being altered in ways that could never be undone. Even in their shared silence, there was a profound recognition of what was being asked of them. The bond between father and daughter, once abstract and dangerous in its subtlety, now became manifest, a living force that shaped their days and nights. They moved through the cabins like shadows themselves, carrying the weight of a secret too terrible to name, a quiet awareness of how far their lives had diverged from any sense of normalcy. Each glance they exchanged was filled with unspoken acknowledgement, the shared knowledge that what was happening was unnatural, yet unstoppable, and that their compliance, reluctant though it was, would determine the unfolding of the hollow's dark legacy. As the days passed, the sisters became both participants and prisoners of the hollow's unspoken rules. Their hearts carried fear, their minds carried doubt, and yet their bodies moved with the rhythm dictated by a patriarch whose will had long since eclipsed any sense of moral restraint. They complied because they could not do otherwise, and in that compliance, the hollow's power grew stronger, shaping not only the present but the future, leaving in its wake a silence that was heavy, pervasive, and filled with a tension that promised even darker revelations yet to come. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper carried on the wind through the hollow. Small changes in the daughter's appearances, gestures, and expressions hinted at something deeper, something that had been slowly gnawing at the edges of their lives for generations. Their eyes, once bright with curiosity or mischief, began to hold a distant, unfocused quality, as though the very air of the hollow had seeped into their minds and dulled their perception. Hands that had once been nimble and sure grew stiff, movements awkward in ways that seemed to mock the innocence of youth. Even their laughter, when it came, carried a hollow note, echoing through the cabins like a sound that belonged more to the wind or the walls than to them. It was not merely physical; the corruption reached deeper, into the thoughts and instincts that guided them. Decisions that should have been simple were approached with hesitation or fear, as though the mind itself had been cauterized against the normal currents of reasoning and empathy. Emotions flickered and died quickly, replaced by a strange acceptance of their circumstances, a resigned loyalty to a pattern of life that outsiders would have called grotesque. The daughters' interactions with one another and with their father carried subtle distortions, a tension that pulsed beneath every word and touch, hinting at a legacy twisted by secrecy and control. The hollow, with its isolation and its shadows, had become a crucible, forging not strength but a brittle, fragile imitation of it, and in that transformation, the seeds of something unnatural had taken root. Even the natural world within the hollow seemed to respond to this creeping corruption. Animals that once moved freely through the woods now kept their distance, birds hesitated before alighting on branches near the cabins, and the livestock appeared skittish, their eyes wide with an almost human apprehension. The land itself seemed tainted, the soil hard and unyielding, the streams carrying a chill that was out of season, and the trees bending toward the cabins as if to shield them from something or perhaps to hide the truth from prying eyes. Visitors, if they dared approach, spoke of a weight in the air, a sense of wrongness that pressed on the chest, as though the hollow itself had absorbed the corruption of generations and exhaled it in a subtle, insidious mist. In the daughters, the signs grew undeniable over time. They were shadows of people they might have been, altered by isolation, manipulation, and the unnatural bonds that had shaped their lives. Their minds and bodies bore the imprint of secrecy and control, and in every glance, every hesitated step, every muted emotion, the hollow whispered of a lineage warped by fear and desire. It was a corruption that could not be ignored, a slow, creeping inevitability that hinted at horrors yet to unfold, and it left a chill in the heart of anyone who glimpsed it, a warning of the darkness that had taken root and refused to release its hold. The night arrived with a heaviness that seemed to press down on the hollow from all sides, a suffocating presence that wrapped the valley in a shroud of anticipation and dread. Clouds had gathered in thick, roiling masses, blotting out the moon and stars, and the wind moved with a restless energy, rattling branches and carrying the faint scent of rain and something far fouler, something human yet unnatural. Within the cabins, the family moved with a tense, deliberate quiet, the youngest daughter tracing every shadow as though expecting them to come alive and reveal the truth she had long feared. The fire in the hearth flickered erratically, sending grotesque shapes dancing across the walls, and each of those shapes seemed to carry a secret, an accusation, or a warning she could not name. The hollow itself seemed awake, aware, and complicit, leaning into the unfolding of a night that would mark the first step into something unspeakable. The father's presence was like the gravity that held the earth itself in orbit. He moved among the cabins with a deliberate calm, his expression unreadable, his eyes holding the promise of inevitability. The daughters, despite the careful training of years, could not escape the tension that threaded through the air, a tension that made every heartbeat feel louder, every breath more visible in the darkness. They had been conditioned to obey, to comply, and yet the reality of what was to come made the hollow feel like a living cage, each wall closing in with silent insistence. The youngest daughter felt a cold clarity, a moment of understanding that whatever had been whispered in shadows, hinted at in diaries, or seen in fleeting glances, was about to take shape in the starkest, most irreversible form. Outside, the storm began to assert itself. Lightning forked through the clouds, illuminating the twisted silhouettes of the trees and the cabins in sharp, blinding flashes. Thunder rolled through the hollow like a drumbeat, echoing in the valleys and ridges as though nature itself were marking the occasion. The wind carried whispers from the past, echoes of generations who had walked the same floorboards, who had lived under the same authority, and who had felt the same oppressive weight of inevitability. Each sound, each shadow, each flicker of firelight became a signal, a reminder that the hollow's secrets were alive and watching, waiting to enfold the daughters into the story that had been set long before their time. And within that darkness, the first act of compliance was to occur. The air seemed to hold its breath along with them, the storm outside and the storm within coalescing into a single, terrible moment. It was a night of fear and fascination, of inevitability and dread, and as the daughters moved through it, guided by obedience and shadowed by the weight of generations, the hollow itself seemed to shudder with recognition, acknowledging that from this night forward, nothing would ever be the same, and the hidden horrors of their secluded life were about to take a form that would echo across the valley for years to come.